Hey, hello again. So I had tickets reserved and a flight ticket and a hotel reservation to go to Can Jam in New York on February 16th and 17th. And I was really excited about going there. I wanted to make an episode about it. And then I went to see the doctor a couple of weeks before that, and the ENT, he said, open your mouth and say ah, and he goes, oh my God, you have like some of the most enlarged tonsils that I've ever seen. And he said, have a seat. When do you want to get those removed? Finally decided to do it on a long holiday weekend so that I could recover without taking more time off work. And that was quite an experience. I had no voice for like 2 weeks, a lot of pain. Now I can talk again, but it was kind of weird at work because when I came back to work after the surgery, I was like, I can't talk. I don't have a voice. And everyone was like, oh, okay. And for like 2 weeks, the whole office was just boisterous and everyone had wonderful conversations and stuff. And I was just thinking, man, I can't wait until I can contribute again to the conversations. And I came into work this week and I was like, hey guys, my voice is pretty much normal again. And they go, oh, that's great. And I wanted to try and engage conversation, but it's just kind of things kind of seemed to settle down a little bit in the office. You know, nobody really seemed too open for conversation. And I just thought, oh, things are like they were before my surgery. Oh man. This episode, I will be covering the Violectric V281 headphone amplifier. So what do I have to say about the Violectric V281? First of all, it is a very powerful solid state amp, and it has a bevy of inputs. So you can put in RCA input, you can do XLR balanced, which is great. But also on the front, you have quite a few essential knobs and dongles. So here is a right and left speaker switch, so you can change the balance. I guess this would work good if you wanted to hear only one side of a track. For example, if you're listening to a Led Zeppelin album and you want to skip the solo on the right channel, you can just completely flip it over. This is the volume knob. And then up here, you can choose XLR or RCA input and outputs. And then you can plug in two separate TRS connections, 3/4 inch jacks, as well as an XLR for balanced headphone output. So when you use balanced, you get a lot more power. It's very, very apparent. Also, if you notice on the back, there are some dip switches. And they're dip switches, not dip, which is what I thought they were calling me when I first heard about it. These are going to raise or lower the amount of power output that comes from the amplifier. I haven't actually messed with it very much, but it is suggested that if you wanted to use really sensitive headphone type equipment such as IEMs, then you might do better to reduce the power output on this, flipping these dip switches around. It'll probably reduce the noise floor, but it will also allow for you to adjust the volume knob up and down with a little more leeway before volume levels are ear-shatteringly loud. There are versions where they have their own DAC installed. Mine does not have a DAC. You can also get the option to have a remote control to adjust the volume from where you're seated. I chose not to go for the remote. I chose not to go for the DAC. Reason being that I'm always sitting next to my amplifiers, so I just move my arm over and switch it. And then the added cost of a DAC on top of the amplifier for me was kind of pointless because I already have the Yggy, and so I'm doing an Yggy straight into the V281 and then powering my headphones with it. Speaking of power, this thing has a lot of juice. It sounds great with a regular TRS connection, but when you put in XLR balanced with a balanced input, it sounds spectacular. And this is an amazing amplifier, especially if you're a fan of solid state amplifiers. I have mentioned before that I am a fan of tube amplifiers and the tube sound, but There are times when a solid state is a good idea. I listen to the V281 a lot, and I've also come to find that I lean more towards dynamic headphones now. So I like dynamic 300 ohm headphones, thus my using OTL amplifiers a lot. You know, higher resistance require a little bit more power to get the punch and the volume output that you might want, so you don't want to plug it into a cell phone. But if you have the V281, 300 ohm dynamic headphones are going to be no challenge at all for this amplifier. For example, when I have it unbalanced input with a 300 ohm headphone, I put the volume up to about 11 o'clock, maybe 12 o'clock. That's pretty darn loud. And then when I have it balanced, I'm sticking it all the way down to like 9 o'clock area, 10 o'clock range. It's just so much power output. And another difference is that if I'm using planar magnetics, such as the Hi-Fi Mann HG560 that I have, or the Mr. Speaker's Alpha Dogs, which I've talked about before, those do need more juice. But in terms of the juice provided with this amplifier, I can just move it up. So if I had a 300 ohm, I'd be about 11 o'clock, right? Well, if I'm at about just past 12 o'clock range, same volume output with planar magnetic headphones. If I'm up to 1 o'clock range with, oh man, it is so loud. It's just gonna blow my eardrums right out of my ears. So you wanna talk about a lot of power. There's plenty overhead after that, but I've never gone beyond this for volume. And even at that level, I was just starting to lose my hearing. It was awesome. This is a great representation of a good solid state amp. So what I noticed immediately is that the soundstage on this is actually pretty good, where when I'm listening with the Mainline, I'll use the Mainline as a reference for a tube amplifier so that I can just kind of give you a little bit of a difference in the characteristics between solid state and tube amplifiers. But always remember that this is a generalization, because some SS solid state amps will want to replicate the sound of a tube, and there are some tube amplifiers, especially if you do tube rolling where you switch out the tubes, it'll cause it to have characteristics to make it sound closer to a solid state. So the transition from one to the other can be more subtle depending on how the entire audio chain is set up. But with that said, as I talk about sound characteristics of the V281, I think mentioning how the Mainline reacts in comparison to this can kind of give you an idea about what to look for as you're listening. And just think, Mainline, okay, a tube amplifier, these kinds of characteristics are probably what you're going to primarily be finding on most tubes. And then with the solid state, as I talk about this, that will be kind of what you should be expecting to hear from most solid state amps. So with the Mainline, I noticed that when I have it plugged in, even with a unbalanced or balanced output into the headphones, balance is a little bit better, but when it comes to soundstage or separation, so soundstage to me, sometimes definitions can be switched up a bit. So for me, I use the term soundstage to represent where I feel like I am positioned based on where the band is playing. So with the Mainline, it feels kind of like I'm more up in the front towards the stage, say 3 or 4 rows back, maybe 5th or 6th row. And then when I'm listening with the V281, it feels like I'm a little bit farther back, say like 8th row, 9th row. So the overall presentation is a little bit more evened out versus the forwardness that comes from me listening with the Mainline to the same music. And for separation, that's about how far apart, say, the speakers might be. So using the same headphones and the same album, if I'm listening with the Mainline, it'll sound as if it's kind of about this much of a range, where I'll hear things coming over from my right, about like right over there, and then from my left, about right there. So when I'm listening with the V281 though, it kind of widens that separation. So it feels a little bit more spread out, and it feels like I'm a little bit farther away. So based on personal preference or the album that you're listening to, one of these might have an advantage over the other. It's all subjective, and it's also based on how the recording goes and how you perceive that soundstage or the separation. Another thing I noticed is that the V281 sounds a lot faster than most tube amplifiers. Faster meaning that with transients, in terms of the decay, how quickly a note remains and how quickly it goes away and fades. Things come in and go out quicker using the V281 versus the mainline. The mainline likes to let notes linger just a little bit longer, but if you have a lot of confusing things going on, the mainline still does a really great job of maintaining order amongst chaos. But with the V281, there's like no challenge whatsoever about being able to discern what's happening with several different instruments going on at once. So that can be fun for very confusing or fast sounding music. This amp has a very hard hitting bass. It's very tight, succinct. And the mainline is also very good at the bass. In terms of bass level, bass output, and within the range, the frequency ranges of the bass, I would say they're very comparable. But the 281 feels a little bit tighter, a little bit quicker response time. But when it comes to the mids, it does a good job with voices, like singing voices, baritone, going up to the alto range. The highs are a lot more crisp than what I get from the mainline or most tube amplifiers. And that's some of the benefit that comes from a good solid state, is that overall, you'll get a good overarching point perspective of the sound in terms of its succinctness and its punch. It'll have a good dynamic punch and it'll kind of hit you harder and then dissipate into the next phase of the music a little bit quicker and more, and it'll have more immediacy versus a lot of tube amps. And so that can be fun, but sometimes it can be a little bit fatiguing. But variety is the spice of life, right? So there are times where I'm just totally in love with the V281. I just can't stop listening to all my favorite tracks. But then maybe after a couple or a few hours, I might go, my ears are getting a little bit tired, you know? And also what happens is, because it is so resolving, it is so quick and so tight in its sound signature, I end up spending more time kind of analyzing what's happening. And so my listening experience sometimes is not as enjoyable. Maybe at first I go, oh, that's amazing, and I'll quickly analyze what's happening and go, oh, this is definitely a change from my other amplifiers. I'm just enjoying the music, but then an hour later, I'll stop and go, hey, I've noticed for the last 20 minutes or so that I haven't really been listening to the music, but so much about how much I'm concentrating on how the amplifier is representing that music. And so then that's when I either stop and I go, oh, okay, time to move on to something else. Sometimes I like something a little bit smoother and richer. But this is not a fault against the V281 in any way. Actually, I think it's actually a compliment to it. Using it through my Yggdrasil DAC and the V281, the two of them together are a beautiful, beautiful combination. When I first got it, I had only the AK320. I didn't have the Yggy with me. And I thought, oh man, this is a really good amp. It sounds great. You know, it really did. It sounded wonderful. But when I put the Yggy in through this, it was just night and day. So that is sort of a testament to how a dedicated DAC can provide so much more resolution, so much more capability and musicality versus a DAP that has to sacrifice all the other components going within it to match price, size, compatibility, and performance. But I'm not knocking against the AK320. The V281 would also sound great with any good DAP. But just remember that if there's no DAC installed inside this, you'll need something presenting analog audio out before it goes into this, because it is only an amplifier, unless you put the DAC in. But I chose not to have the DAC option. Blah, 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 blah. So anyone who is looking for a high quality solid state amplifier, I don't think you'd be doing yourself a disservice to get the V281. I really like the amplifier for what solid state amps are able to do very well, and that is to be very fast, very powerful, have a great soundstage, and a lot of that clarity, precision, the succinctness of solid state is well represented with this amplifier. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed what I had to say. Sorry about the hesitation for releasing a new episode. My plan is to have my next episode out sooner rather than later, and I will discuss the Verite. That will be a rather long episode, but we'll see what happens. And until then, have a great day, have a good week, have a good weekend, whatever. Just be happy and enjoy your music.